Fans of horror games have benefited more than most from the meteoric rise of online gaming, with many of the genre's most famous titles and franchises having started life as free-to-play indie games. With Flash games no longer a thing, Steam is now one of the very best places for those indie game developers to showcase their work, thanks in large to the sheer size of the platform. This obviously works out pretty well for players too, effectively ensuring that there are always plenty of new free-to-play games just waiting to be discovered on Steam. Fans of horror games are particularly spoiled for choice in this regard, as there's an ever-growing number of fantastic free-to-play horror games on Steam. Welcome to Game Rant, everyone. My name is Geoffrey. In today's video, I will be highlighting 20 of the very best free-to-play horror games that you should check out right now on Steam. Number 20, AfterHours. It may be a little rough around the edges in places, but what AfterHours lacks in polish, it more than makes up for with atmospheric excellence. The game can be unnervingly spooky at times, thanks in large to the thought and meticulous attention to detail that went into designing its setting and its excellent use of sound. Like many other free-to-play horror games before it, AfterHours takes place in an abandoned hospital. Players must explore and escape the derelict facility, while simultaneously being stalked by the mysterious creature that resides there. Stealth and silence will be key for those hoping to survive, though even then, nothing is really guaranteed. Number 19, Wretched Depths. Wretched Depths feels a lot like a cross between Fishing Sim Dredge and Mizurna Falls, a Japan-only PS1 game with open-world mechanics from the late 90s. The free-to-play title tasks players with exploring the remote town of Twin Pines and the depths of Lake Imperium, both of which contain their fair share of mysteries. Even if it weren't for the fact that it was developed by University of Utah students, Wretched Depths would still be an incredibly impressive title. Playing the game, it seems clear what the developers were trying to achieve, and for the most part, they absolutely nail it. Granted, it is a little rough around the edges in places, but it's still worth checking out. Number 18, Cursed. Most people have probably never heard of Disaster Squad Productions' Cursed trilogy, which, in truth, is a real shame. The 3 point-and-click games are full to the brim with passion, and although they rarely end up being scary despite the many horror themes and motifs that can be found throughout them, this doesn't make them any less enjoyable for players. It's always nice to see an indie developer improving with each new game, and this is very much the case with Cursed. Not only do the visuals improve from game to game, but so too does the gameplay, painting the picture of a developer who is gradually mastering the tools of their trade. It will be interesting to see what comes next now that the trilogy has been concluded. Number 17, Dark Deception. Dark Deception is a little bit like Pac-Man, only with pink shards instead of tiny yellow pellets, and terrifying monkey bellhops replacing all the ghosts. You know, the usual things. The giant maze that players are forced to navigate is equally intimidating, with the rundown hotel providing no safe havens in which players can hide to catch their breath. It's perhaps that last detail that makes Dark Deception such a great free-to-play horror game, as players are forced to remain on guard for the entire duration of their playthrough. Knowing that one of the evil monkey bellhops could be lurking just around the corner is really quite frightening, as two is being chased by one only to find the path ahead of them blocked by another. Number 16, We Went Back. Set in an abandoned space station, the feelings of isolation evoked by We Went Back really help to enhance the experience and contribute a lot to the game's terrifying aesthetic. The pacing is incredibly slow, which certainly may not be to everybody's taste, but this does help to crank up the tension quite a bit. For an indie game, everything looks fantastic, and there are plenty of small details that help to add to the game's authenticity. Like a lot of other free games though, it is relatively short, coming in at just under an hour in length. The time looping mechanic is really cool, however, even if the monster that stalks the player throughout the ship is a little lackluster. Number 15, Fears to Fathom Home Alone. Fears to Fathom is an episodic series where each episode tells a different story through the eyes of one of the survivors. The grainy visuals do an excellent job of keeping players on edge, while the fantastic storytelling provides more than enough incentive to continue plodding on into the unknown. It's one of the most intense free games on Steam, especially in the horror territory, and during its strongest moments is able to evoke genuine feelings of fear. It's a fairly short affair when all's said and done, but the promise of new episodes should be enough to have players checking back in from time to time. Number 14, Fleshwater. With a name like Fleshwater, prospective players can probably get a pretty good idea of what to expect from Euphoric Brothers' free-to-play horror game even before they start playing. Once they do, they'll be controlling a worker at a pet feeding company as they prepare food for a client who is more than just a little out of the ordinary. Throwing together a slap-up meal for a mysterious aquatic monster may not sound all that fun on paper, but there's a sense of dread lingering throughout the entirety of the short indie title that manages to keep the heart racing from start to finish. At around an hour or so in length, it is a relatively short game, though it does feature 4 different endings for those who just can't get enough. Number 13, Grimm's Hollow. Despite first being released back in 2019, it took a little while for people to really start to notice Grimm's Hollow. These days, however, the game has thousands of positive reviews on Steam, with many players praising its fantastic narrative, engaging gameplay, and thought-provoking themes, amongst many other things. It's a horror RPG that, at a glance, at least is a little reminiscent of Undertale and the Clock Tower series, though it's far shorter than either of these when it comes to length. That's not to say that it feels rushed or anything though, and considering it's a free-to-play game, the amount of content that's on offer is actually quite impressive. Number 12, Lake of Voices. Visual novels may not be as immersive as certain other video game genres due to their largely linear nature, but they can still be incredibly enjoyable when done correctly. Lake of Voices is an excellent example of this, with the game's creator, GB Patch Games, playing to the strengths of the medium to tell what is ultimately both an interesting and ominous tale. Like in any good choose-your-own-adventure style game, the decisions that players are faced with at times can have dire consequences for the story's characters. In that respect, it feels a bit like a low-budget Dark Pictures anthology game, yet there's a certain charm to the visuals that just can't be found in the crisp graphics of the supermassive game series. Number 11, Mr. Hopp's Playhouse. Developed and published by Moonbit and released in late 2019, Mr. Hopp's Playhouse is a free-to-play horror game in which players control a young girl named Ruby, who is being stalked through her home by a handmade toy. The titular rabbit and overall experience are all made all the more terrifying by the game's simple yet really effective art style. In many ways, it's like a cross between one of the many 2D side-scrollers that were pumped out during the early 90s and the Five Nights at Freddy's series that perfectly captures the irrational fears of kids, and well, some of us as adults. It's perhaps this relatability that makes it such a scary game, and one that is well worth checking out for horror game fans. Number 10, My Friend is a Raven. In bereft land, the raven cries, and with it comes a calamity that wipes the world. My Friend is a Raven is a short adventure with visually striking hand-drawn graphics, and sees players controlling Ludum, the last survivor of a devastating plague that has ravaged the world and left humanity on the brink of extinction. As Ludum, the player returns to their old apartment in search of a sickened raven who tells the truth about why the calamity has come. The game features intriguing puzzles and an enticing and atmospheric story that unfolds between 4 different endings, all of which center around the apocalyptic setting. Number 9, Ultimate Custom Night. Though the Five Nights at Freddy's games are by no means expensive, the majority of them don't quite fall into the free-to-play category. There is one, however, that does fit the bill, and it's one that features no fewer than 50 of the series' terrifying animatronics for players to pit their wits against. Those who have never played a FNAF game should prepare themselves for a barrage of jump scares, as well as some really unsettling imagery. With enough practice, players can shield themselves from the frights as they learn how to master the many scenarios on offer in Ultimate Custom Night, but when they start out, they're likely to make plenty of fatal mistakes. Number 8, Perfect Vermin. Perfect Vermin places a sledgehammer in players' hands and tasks them with exterminating all of the vermin in an empty office block, the normal day for most workers. It's not quite as simple as that though, as the vermin in question are a little more than just rats and mice, but we'll try to avoid spoilers. Players are able to destroy pretty much every single appliance and piece of furniture in the office, which can help the game feel just as cathartic as it is unsettling. Though incredibly short, the game is thoroughly enjoyable and features a surprisingly well fleshed out story for a game that, on the surface, can appear as though it doesn't have one. It can be a little confusing at times, and a lot of it is actually left up to your personal interpretation. That's arguably all part of the game's appeal though, and will likely prompt a replay or two for those who want to fully wrap their heads around what they've just played and experienced. Number 7. Poppy Playtime. Released in late 2021, Poppy Playtime quickly began attracting attention among fans of Steam horror games. However, it wasn't until the game went free to play in May of the following year that its popularity really exploded. Now, the game's antagonist, Huggy Wuggy, is arguably one of the most recognizable figures in modern gaming, and for very good reason. Poppy Playtime does an excellent job of building suspense and lulling players into a false sense of security. When Huggy Wuggy does finally appear though, the tone quickly changes, with players having to flee from the Big Blue experiment or risk facing a terrifying fate. It really is great and is hands down one of the best free horror games on Steam. Number 6. SCP Secret Laboratory. There are plenty of great SCP games to choose from, the majority of which are actually free to play. Unfortunately, not all of them are worth playing, even if there's no real cost involved. This is far from the case with SCP Secret Laboratory, however, as evidenced by its 100,000 plus very positive reviews on Steam. Northwood Studios' solitary stab at making a secure, contained, protect game really couldn't have gone much better. It looks great for a 2017 indie game, and the multiplayer elements are incredibly well thought out. Despite being almost half a decade old, it still has pretty healthy player base too, meaning that there shouldn't be too many long waits to get into the game if you're interested. Number 5. Slender Threads Prologue. Though nowhere near as prominent as it was back in the 80s and 90s, the point-and-click genre has seen something of a nice resurgence in recent years. Slender Threads is so far shaping up to be yet another fantastic addition to the genre at large, thanks to its intriguing story and charming art style. Players shouldn't let the latter fool them though. If the prologue is anything to go by, Slender Threads is going to be a pretty violent game, with blood and gore playing a somewhat central role. It's more than just shock value though, with the developers also able to create real moments of tension at times, thanks in large part to the dark and daunting atmosphere that smothers the town of Villa Ventana and its residents there. Number 4. Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion. Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion starts off as an adorable haunted house simulator and ends up as a genuinely disconcerting walk through 1,000 rooms of terror. A good amount of the initial audience thought this would be yet another joke game that deployed cheap mechanics over clever ones, but Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion is actually a labor of love on the developer's part, and it really shows. An HD quote-unquote renovation of sorts is also available on Steam for a higher price, and fans of the original will be happy to see higher resolutions, 3D fixes, VR support, and several other requested features from the game's early access days. For everyone else though, the free-to-play version should be more than adequate and is definitely well worth a look. Number 3. The Devil Haunts Me. Loom, a developer gaining quick traction in the horror community for its stylistic top-down survival horror games, released its first game in 2018 to much acclaim. The Devil Haunts Me is a short survival game about accruing resources and exploring the forests around the player's home while uncovering dark tidings between the trees. As players go about their routine, gathering wood, water, and food for the day, secrets begin to reveal themselves in the forest. These secrets will be enticing at first, begin to make the forest much less inviting as the game goes on, and it soon becomes apparent that something else in these woods has an agenda, a dark one, and the player is little more than an intruder on this land. Number 2. The Supper. To be completely fair to the developer, all of Octavia Navarro's games, including Midnight Scenes and The Librarian, are worth playing for the same reason as this one, The Supper. Navarro, in his time as a creator, has become famous for his short but sweet approach, further appealing to adventure game fans with a classic point-and-click style. The Supper is a grisly and atmospheric short that focuses on the darkest side of the human soul. As the protagonist collects ingredients and begins cooking up a delicious feast for her distinguished guests, players will unwind to a deeper and more provoking story than one might expect from such a simplistic premise. Number 1. Trick and Treat. Trick and Treat is an incredibly well put together RPG Maker game that promises players a lighthearted Halloween adventure. They'll be controlling a witch named Charlotte and her young maiden Amelia, who eventually find themselves trick-or-treating at a cursed mansion full of thought-provoking puzzles and dangerous traps. None of the puzzles found throughout the game are too challenging, nor are the horror elements particularly graphic either. That said, there is still quite a bit of blood and plenty of jump scares, so it's probably not a great game for young kids. With multiple endings available, there is a certain degree of replayability too, though most will probably have had their fill after a single 90-minute playthrough. And there we have it, everyone. 20 delightfully spooky, scary, macabre, and otherworldly free-to-play horror games that you should definitely check out on Steam when you get the chance. Thank you so much for watching this video from Game Rant. Have a truly wonderful and happy day. See you in the next video. Bye bye.